Let's go ahead and continue our conversation about manufacturing in America. And I want to bring in now Jeremy Haft, who is in our CBS News Washington Bureau. Jeremy is an adjunct professor at Georgetown University, specializing in trade and competitiveness in jobs. He wrote a recent opinion piece in Forbes called "Trump's Border Tax Talk Threatens Rust Belt Jobs." Welcome to you, Jeremy.
Thank you, Elaine. Good to be here.
Well, let me start off by asking you, many Americans voted for President Trump based on his propensity to boost job growth in the country. However, in your op-ed, you argue that some of his proposed economic policies could actually be harmful to growth. What did you find?
Well, that's right. I mean, throughout the campaign, we saw the Rust Belt as the poster child for globalization gone wrong. So tombstones scattered across the landscape, shuttered factories. Trump gave his big speech on trade and jobs in Pennsylvania. And of course, there was the inauguration speech about American carnage. But when you scratch the surface and look at really what's happening in the Rust Belt, you see a very different picture. Yes, there have been communities that have been devastated through lost jobs and the closing of plants. But the greatness of American competitiveness is also on display in the Rust Belt. What we see is a vital powerhouse of advanced manufacturing and exporting. So if we just look at Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, sort of core Rust Belt states, we'd see that tens of thousands of companies are exporting their products to the world, to Canada, to Mexico, to China. And these companies support hundreds of thousands of jobs. Now, what do they make? They make auto parts, airplane parts, advanced machinery, chemicals, optics, and all of these jobs would be threatened by Trump's proposed economic policies that we heard all through the campaign and into the first month of the administration, where tariffs and a border adjustment tax, which essentially is meant to save and protect jobs, would actually threaten jobs across the Rust Belt and across this country.
Well, Jeremy, let me ask you, tariffs are a pretty traditional populist response to boost jobs. And in your op-ed, you write, tariffs pick winners and losers, protecting some jobs at the expense of others. If we want trade policies that help all American workers, we first need to revamp the way we measure trade. And I think this example that you talk about is fascinating. You're basically saying the metrics that we use to talk about trade are wrong. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. Well, basically, the metrics we've been using to describe trade have predated globalization. So, in effect, we're measuring trade as if we were still swapping wine for cloth, which is a 150-year-old paradigm. These days, most products are not made in one country. So, for example, this tie or this ballpoint pen or the iPhone in my pocket or the Advil I took a few minutes ago, they're made by many countries. But the problem is our trade numbers consider a product made 100% by the last country that shipped it to us. So, for example, an iPhone contains only about 6 to 7% Chinese value add. And yet we count it as 100% Chinese value add in our trade numbers. So this gets us into trouble because the trade balances make China and Mexico, for example, much larger in their trade footprint than they actually are. And it obscures America's contribution. It minimizes America's trade footprint. And this gets to the heart of why the tariffs would threaten jobs, because most of what we import from countries like Canada and Mexico contain a high degree of U.S.-made content that we don't count in our numbers. So, for example, when we're importing cars from Canada and Mexico, they contain a high degree of U.S.-made auto parts, at least 60%. So if you raise prices on the imported Canadian and Mexican cars, you're going to depress the demand for the auto parts that go into those cars, and therefore would threaten jobs at all the auto parts factories that span the Rust Belt.
Yeah, I mean, so let's talk more specifically about NAFTA. The president has expressed fierce opposition to NAFTA. He blames it for the heavy job losses in the Rust Belt. He calls it the worst trade deal in history. Has that policy been as hurtful, in your view, as the president claims?
No, it hasn't, and the numbers bear this out. I mean, if you look at employment numbers in the manufacturing sector, for example, really manufacturing jobs started a steep decline in 1979. So that was 15 years before NAFTA was signed into law. There are other dynamics at play here that are driving down manufacturing, and they're mostly productivity gains and technology gains. Trade and the impact of trade on jobs and manufacturing has been grossly distorted, again, by out-of-date metrics. So no, I would argue that NAFTA has actually been a boon to many industries. It's a huge driver of growth in the agriculture sector, for example, and also in many of our advanced manufacturing sectors. And again, these areas would be threatened if NAFTA were suddenly repealed.
Well, so yes, if the president does go ahead and scrap NAFTA, what do you think the implications and the impact of that would be?
Well, we've already seen on the Hill clamorings and stirrings by many of the industries trying to get the president's ear to say, look, especially the agriculture sector and other sectors have approached the president and said, look, if NAFTA is repealed, we're going to take a big hit. So if NAFTA were to go away, I think we would see millions of jobs across the United States impacted. And that's not an exaggeration because the Commerce Department estimated that over 10 million jobs in the United States are directly supported by exports. So with Canada and Mexico as our number 1 and number 2 export markets and China as our number 3 export market, with NAFTA going away, that would suddenly make our exports less competitive and would take away the platform that our exporters use to access these markets as they do today. So without NAFTA, you'd see a great deal of hurt across this economy and ironically in the very base that voted for President Trump.
Jeremy, before we let you go, I've just been handed additional excerpts from the president's address to a joint session of Congress that we're expecting to take place here in just about an hour or so. This excerpt reads, "We will raise wages, help the unemployed, save billions of dollars, and make our communities safer for everyone. Our economic team is developing the historic tax reform that will reduce the tax rate on our companies so they can compete and thrive anywhere, and will anyone. At the same time, we will provide massive tax relief for the middle class." Let's go ahead and take the first part of that. The corporate tax rate is something that we have heard. We heard candidate Trump talk about. We heard a number of his Republican opponents talk about as being a factor in keeping the economy from reaching its full potential. What is your view on what the president is here talking about, cutting the tax rate for corporations, the theory being that will encourage them to stay in this country and therefore create more jobs?
Well, we've heard this theory proposed over the years, and really the corporate tax code is among the lowest in the world. And if you look at our exports, you would see that, in fact, the United States is not some hobbled economy that is uncompetitive. In fact, in 92% of all congressional districts, our exports to China have at least doubled over the past 10 years. So that means in every state, in almost every district, in every town, in every city, our exports to China and to the world are booming. So the corporate tax rate is not some kind of impediment to our competing. In fact, American companies remain the most competitive in the world.
And the second part of that, providing massive tax relief for the middle class. Obviously, no specifics in this particular excerpt, but that certainly sounds like that would be welcome news to a lot of Americans.
It would be welcome news to a lot of Americans, including this middle class earner. But the question is, how do we pay for that? Ultimately, my concern is if we cut taxes significantly, then there'll be a big temptation to raise revenues through this border adjustment tax, which we're told will raise in excess of $1 trillion a year. But again, I believe that would directly harm American interests and particularly manufacturing workers. So yes, I think a tax cut would be great. How stimulative it would be to the economy is up to debate, but the way you pay for it is the question. And if you pay for it through tariffs and through border adjustment taxes, that would be a big loss. Just look at steel. Every steel job saved through tariffs over the years has killed 3 American jobs downstream. Every job in tires, in tire manufacturing that was saved through tariffs kills 3 jobs downstream. So yes, tariffs pick winners and losers. And if you want to favor some American workers over other American workers, I would say that that goes to the very basic question of fairness. If we want to promote all American workers, then we need to think differently about our trade policies and our tax policies.
All right, we will watch to see what details the president provides on all of these issues in the coming hour. Jeremy Haft in Washington, we very much appreciate your perspective.
Thanks so much for having me.